We're gonna be in Mark chapter 5 this morning, and I wanna begin with a question. And the question is, what's the riskiest thing that you've ever done? What's the riskiest thing that you've ever done? Can you imagine back to that moment, that occasion that you found yourself doing something that was filled with great fear and trembling, that you took a risk? I've told you some of my crazy stories about exploring caves when I was a teenager, and sometimes those felt risky, but there was one particular occasion that comes to my mind as a moment that felt especially risky. I went with a group of students from our student ministry when I was a teenager, and we went rock climbing. It was something that we did quite frequently. I had a lot of experience with it, probably more so than anybody else in the group, but this time a whole group of us went to climb, and we got to this place where we were gonna climb and found the best path up, and a lot of the other students began to ascend, and it just looked like they were taking the easy route to me. And so I looked for another place that was gonna be a little less crowded and perhaps a little bit more challenging for someone who was a little more experienced. And I started up this sheer face on the side of this massive rock. And I got partway up, well up off the ground, and I was stuck, and I was terrified. I had one little handhold and one little foothold and was searching to try to find some place that I could grab to move just a little bit higher. My whole body began to shake from both fatigue, as my muscles were getting tired, and from fear. The other group that had gone up the easy path had gotten up higher than me, and so they were able to look back down and point out some direction that I could go. I was high enough off the ground at that point that if I had fallen, I might not have died, but it would have included serious bodily injury. And so they were able to shout to me words of encouragement and direction and help me find my way a little bit higher up. And finally, I was able to scramble up and to find a place that leveled off just a little bit. And I sat there to regain my composure. And I had sewing machine legs. You know what I'm talking about? That when your body just is going like a sewing machine, shaking from both that sense of weariness and fear. I was terrified. It was risky. Some of us are natural risk takers. We enjoy the charge that comes from taking risks. Others of us perhaps are a little more risk averse. We like to play it safe. And I think all of us can find ourselves in relationships with a little bit of risk aversion. It feels risky to entrust someone else with our story, with our life, with our hopes and dreams. It can feel risky to share with someone else our fear, our pain, our struggles. And I think it can even feel that way with Jesus, that it can feel risky to really trust him, to entrust him with our whole life, to entrust him with our hopes and dreams, to entrust him with our fears and our pain and our struggles. And this morning, I want to look with you at one of my favorite little Jesus stories, and I want to show you the risky faith of the characters involved. And I think as we explore this story together, what we're gonna find is that they show us that the context in which we come to know Jesus' power is the context of our powerlessness. The context in which we come to really discover, to really experience and know Jesus' power in our lives is in the context of our powerlessness. And we find that the condition upon which we experience Jesus' power in our lives is the condition of risky faith. We're this week in the third week of a sermon series that we're calling The Unexpected Jesus. In the course of this series, we're looking at some of the miracle stories of things that Jesus did. And we've been talking about the idea that the miracle stories of Jesus in the Gospels are about so much more than merely demonstrations of Jesus' divine power. If we look at them only in terms of somehow proof that Jesus is divine, we completely miss the richness of what's there. That these stories of Jesus' miracles show us something of the way that Jesus sees the world, something of the way that Jesus wants the world to be, and something of the way in which Jesus will one day make the world. These miracle stories are more about Jesus' character and Jesus' love. And then I said to you on the first week of this series that some of you may be here in this series and you find yourself in a place where you're skeptical. You have a hard time believing that these miracles actually happened. And my invitation to you was to journey with us through this series and to explore more deeply why these things happened. And that in so doing, you might actually come to find it easier to believe that they happened. And so this morning, we're gonna look at this story that's told in Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 21. And there we read, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, and he pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." Mark tells us the context of this is as Jesus has come back to the Jewish side of the lake. We looked at the story last week of Jesus going to the other side, the Gentile side, where he encountered a man that was possessed by a legion of demons. Jesus did what no good rabbi of the day would do by going to the other side. But now he's come back home, likely to Capernaum, his kind of base of operations. And as he's returned there, he's approached by a man named Jairus. We're told that Jairus is the synagogue leader. What that means is that he's like the chairman of the elder board of the only church in town. Jairus is likely one of the most affluent, one of the most admired, one of the most privileged members of that community. He sits at the top of the heap, socially and religiously speaking. He's a member of the religious establishment, and already in Mark's gospel, if we've been reading along, we find that the religious establishment doesn't exactly get along with Jesus. And yet here, he's not the top of the heap. Here, he's not the powerful synagogue leader, the influential community leader. Here, he's not a member of the religious establishment. Here, he's just a desperate father who comes and throws himself at the feet of Jesus. You know, one of the things that I love more than anything else in life is the opportunity to help people learn to read the Bible with their imagination, to help think about what the characters in the story might have seen, what the characters in the story might have felt, what they might have experienced as they were living through this. I love to help people read the Bible with their imagination, but I gotta tell you, I can't go there very long with this little passage because I can hardly imagine a more difficult sentence to utter than the one that Jairus utters here when he says, "My little daughter is dying." He's a desperate father, terrified that he's about to lose his little girl. And so he comes and he throws himself at Jesus' feet. This powerful man adopts a posture of powerlessness and says, "Jesus, please come help me. Maybe, just maybe, if you lay your hand on her, she'll live." And Mark tells us at the end of this plea, and Jesus went with him. I gotta tell you, I love that little sentence. In the story itself, it's really just there to kind of move things along, and yet it speaks deeply to me because I think the thing that we can cling to when we find ourselves in those situations where we are powerless, when we find ourselves in those moments of desperation, here's what we can know. He will go with us. That he doesn't promise here that he's gonna fix it. He doesn't promise that he's gonna make it all okay. He just goes with him. And in our times of desperation, in our experiences of powerlessness, we can rest assured that he will go with us. The story continues, but it's interrupted actually by another story. Mark puts a story inside of a story, and we see this second movement beginning verse 24. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been freed from her suffering. There's a large crowd, and Jesus and his disciples are making their way through the crowd, and this woman who's there sees Jesus. She's heard about his reputation as a healer, as a miracle worker. Maybe, just maybe, could he be the one? Could he be the Messiah? She has this thought. I've exhausted all of my other options. Maybe, just maybe, he could bring me healing. She'd suffered from a debilitating condition for 12 long years, essentially the equivalent of 12 years of menstrual flow that never stops. That rendered her ceremonially unclean. By the whole community, she was considered unclean. She was unclean and incapable of coming into the religious assembly, to come into the synagogue. She was unclean and therefore couldn't be touched by other people. If there was a man ever in her life, by this point, he has probably long since abandoned her. And we're told that she spent every penny that she had on doctors trying to get better. And yet, each time her hope arose, and each time it was disappointed. And instead of getting better, Mark tells us that she just continued to get worse. That she finds herself as far at the other end of the social spectrum from Jairus as she could possibly be. She is penniless. She is untouchable. She is unclean. She is at the bottom of the heap, socially and religiously speaking. But she thinks, if I can just touch his garment, maybe, just maybe, I'll be healed. And so she very carefully sneaks her way up alongside Jesus and reaches out and touches the corner of his garment. Now, what's the deal with the corner of the garment? What's so significant about that? Well, I want to tell you what I think is going on in this passage. And I brought with me my prayer shawl that I brought in the old city of Jerusalem. I have another similar prayer shawl that I bought on a trip in Israel. Actually, I bought at a location that was very close to where this story itself took place. I bought this one from a vendor on the street in the old city, and I think the other one I paid about 5 times more because I bought it from a fancy gift shop. This one I bought from a street vendor, but it's a prayer shawl that would have been, in that time, worn by faithful Jewish men. And even to this day, you can find faithful Jewish men who wear a prayer shawl. And the prayer shawl is wrapped around them. And the garment has 4 corners. The prayer shawl itself is called the talit. Can I hear you say that? Talit. The corners of the prayer shawl are called the kanaf. Let me hear you say kanaf. The word kanaf in Hebrew literally means wings, and you can sort of imagine where they might have gotten that imagery for the prayer shawl. And then hanging from each of the 4 corners are called the tzitzi. Can I hear you say that? Tzitzi. The tzitzi are these little tassels that hang down, and they are made up of 613 strands that represent the 613 commandments of God in the Old Testament. This would be essentially like us walking around wearing a Bible around our neck. You could do it, but it might look a little funny, right? But the idea is that they're to be reminded that they live under the law, the commandments of God. And Jesus, as a good, faithful Jewish man, would have worn a prayer shawl, something similar to this. And it seems that when we read in the text that she came and she touched the corner of his garment, that what is meant is the kanaf, the corners, the wings. And it seems that maybe, just maybe, that this woman in the story called to mind a verse from the book of Malachi. Malachi chapter 4, verse 2, writing about the coming of the Messiah one day. Malachi says, "But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, healing in its kanaf. And she goes and touches just the corner of his garment. She reaches out to touch the tzitzi, those tassels hanging down from his prayer shawl. And Mark says, immediately, she's healed. Now, she got what she was looking for, right? The story can continue on. It can proceed from there, and yet Jesus won't have it that way. Look what happens next. We pick up next in verse 30. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people in the crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Jesus is pressing through this crowd of people, and he realizes that something's happened. He realizes that power has gone out from him. So he says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, "Jesus, look at the crowd. Who didn't touch you, man? Come on, let's go. We've got to get to Jairus' house." But he stops, and he says, "Who touched me?" And she hears his question, and she's terrified. She's got sewing machine legs, and she comes and she throws herself at Jesus' feet. Here, she takes the same posture as Jairus, the posture of powerlessness. She's terrified because she knows that she's done something that everybody in that crowd would consider wrong and a big deal. She, who was unclean, reached out and touched him who was clean, a rabbi. And the thought of that day was that if an unclean person touched a clean person, that their uncleanness was transferred, that the one who was unclean made the clean one now unclean. The beautiful thing that we see time and time again in the miracle stories of Jesus is that with Jesus, it works the opposite way. With Jesus, rather than her uncleanness being transferred to him, with Jesus, it's his cleanness being transferred to her. She comes and she falls at his feet, trembling with fear. She tells him the whole story, expecting perhaps a harsh rebuke. And instead, she gets a word of tenderness. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Go in shalom would have been the word on Jesus' lips. This rich Hebrew word that captures the idea of wholeness and harmony and flourishing and delight, everything being the way that it's supposed to be. Jesus says to her, go in shalom. Go be healed. Go be whole. Now, why does Jesus do this? Why does Jesus stop? And she, after all, has gotten what she came looking for, right? She got her healing, and yet for Jesus, her physical healing wasn't enough. What Jesus does is he not only restores her physically, he restores her socially. Jesus not only grants her physical healing, he grants her the dignity that she deserves as an image bearer of God. He restores her both physically and socially. Your faith has healed you. Go in shalom. But what we find is that even as the words are on Jesus' lips, messengers come from Jairus' house. Look with me. Verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. Your daughter is dead, they said. Why bother the teacher anymore? And overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid, just believe. That it's as Jesus is speaking the words to this woman, daughter, go in shalom, that the word comes that Jairus' daughter is dead. And how must Jairus have felt in that moment? when he hears those words and he thinks about the fact that Jesus stopped to attend to her, to deal with her, that I can't help but think that he's thinking that, Jesus, this woman has been sick as long as my daughter has been alive. Surely she could have waited just a little bit longer. And the text doesn't tell us, but again, engaging our imagination, I imagine at this moment that Jairus' knees buckle out from under him, that he falls to the ground in intense grief. And yet, as I imagine the scene playing out, I imagine Jesus going over to him, taking his face in his hands and looking him deep in the eye and saying to him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Don't be afraid, just trust me. Jesus doesn't say, trust me, I'm gonna fix this. Trust me, I'm gonna make it okay. Trust me, I'm gonna raise her from the dead. Trust me, she's not really dead after all. He just says to him, don't be afraid. Trust me. Just believe. And I can't help but think that in a room like this, there's some of us today who need to hear those words from Jesus. That whatever it is that you're facing, that whatever it is that has you feeling powerless, the words of Jesus to you today, don't be afraid. Trust me. So the story continues on. Look with me in verse 37. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the synagogue leaders, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. And after he'd put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and disciples who were with him, and he went into where the child was. And he took her by the hand, and he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Jesus takes along three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, his inner circle of followers. And we've talked before about the fact that they get special access to Jesus, right? That he keeps them very close by. But we've talked before about the fact that, when you were a kid in school, if your desk got pulled up closest to the teacher, it wasn't necessarily a compliment, right? It didn't necessarily mean that she just really loved having you close. It meant she was trying to keep an eye on you, trying to keep you out of trouble. And maybe, just maybe, I can't help but wonder if he knows that that's the case with Peter, James, and John, because we know Peter has a tendency to put his foot in his mouth and to act before he thinks. And we know James and John have the nickname Sons of Thunder. So Jesus may have known that if he just left them behind, it was actually gonna create more problem for him. And so he says, "You three, come with me." And they go to the house. And they get there and this big commotion is happening. People crying and wailing. And this was a part of their cultural tradition that when a death happened, that many people would come and gather around and that everybody would enter into this loud wailing, crying, moaning. And Jesus sees this crowd and he says to them, "She's just sleeping." And they turn on a dime. They go from crying and wailing to derisive laughter. "Give me a break, Jesus, right? You're ridiculous. She's dead." And Jesus sends them all, he shoos them out, and then he takes the parents and he goes into where the girl's body is laying. And I love this little detail in the story. He took her by the hand. A dead body was considered unclean. A dead body was untouchable. It was believed that if you touched a dead body, that uncleanness came onto you. But once again, as we see time and time again in Jesus' miracles, her uncleanness doesn't come onto him. His cleanness goes into her. That he takes her by the hand. And he says to her this Aramaic expression, "Talitha cum." Now, anytime you see one of these little statements where the Aramaic is provided and then it says in parentheses, "which means, I say to you," Anytime you see an Aramaic phrase that's been kept by the author, what you have is the original is written in Greek, but sometimes you get these little Aramaic phrases thrown in, which is curious to then think, why is it that he keeps the Aramaic? Because everything Jesus said would have been in Aramaic. That would have been the standard spoken language of the day. So why keep the Aramaic in this particular case? Anytime you see it, you have to ask that question, why? What's going on there? And what we find is we look back at this little phrase, Talitha cum. It's a standard way that a mother would wake up her little girl in the morning. She'd go into her room and say to her sweetly, Talitha cum, wake up. I think I've told you the story before about when I was a kid, my mom would wake me up every day. My mom, some of you know her, she is the sweetest, gentlest, kindest person on the planet. And so every morning she would come into my room and she would just crack open the door and she'd say it the same way every day with the same little sing-song voice. Barry, good morning, time to wake up. And if I didn't stir, she'd come a little bit closer. Barry, good morning, time to wake up. And she'd do it again and again and again until finally I stirred and got up. Always with that same sweet little sing-song voice. And she did it every day, I think until I turned 18 and left the house. It's very different than the way we wake up our kids today, right? We're always running late. Get up, it's time to go, you're late, get in the shower. And Jesus takes this little girl by the hand and he says to her, Talitha cum, little girl, get up. And Mark says, and immediately she got up. And Jesus tells them very clearly, very sternly, don't tell anybody, but give her something to eat, because apparently you can work up quite an appetite when you're dead. But this instruction of Jesus is quite peculiar. I mean, Mark makes a point. Jesus tells them very specifically, very directly, he says to them, he gave them strict orders not to let anybody know about this, which is completely the opposite way of the way that I would handle it, right? Because they just laughed at me. So I would take that little girl and march her out there to the crowd and show her off. See, I told you so. And yet Jesus doesn't handle it that way at all. Jesus says, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. And what's really interesting is that time and time and time again, when Jesus does miracles, this is the way the story of the miracle ends. Now, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Again, not the way that I would operate, right? If I had miracle power, I would want everybody to know, because there would be a great crowd that would gather around and follow after me. But Jesus knew that on that side of his cross and his resurrection, that people wouldn't get it. People would flock to him merely because he was a miracle worker. And Jesus never did his miracles for PR purposes. When Jesus does a miracle, it's because he encounters the vandalism of shalom. And everywhere Jesus goes, these little glimpses of shalom just break out and show up. And Jesus sees this situation. This is not the way that it's supposed to be. And he raises the girl from the dead. But he knows that he didn't just come to raise isolated individuals from the dead. He came so that everybody might have the possibility of resurrection and eternal life. But he knew in order to provide that it would cost him his own life, which would lead to his own resurrection. And on that side of his cross and resurrection, Jesus knew that they just wouldn't get it. And they would flock to him for all the wrong reasons. And so he strictly instructs them, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. Here we find two characters, Jairus and the bleeding woman. Jairus, who sits at the top of the heap socially, religiously. The bleeding woman, who in the story doesn't even get a name, she's at the opposite end of the spectrum. She is at the bottom of the heap socially and religiously. And yet in this story, both of them are powerless. And in their powerlessness, they both adopt the same posture, coming and throwing themselves at the feet of of Jesus. And moved by compassion, he responds. Each of them show risky faith. But what we find in looking at their stories is that the context in which we come to experience Jesus' power is the context of our powerlessness. It's only when we reach the end of ourselves that we really come to know and experience his power. It's only when we are willing to say, Jesus, I am weak, I need you. It's only when we come and we throw ourselves at his feet that we come to know and experience Jesus' power most powerfully when we are powerless. The context in which we come to experience Jesus' power is our powerlessness. The condition upon which we experience Jesus' power is the condition of our risky faith, our willingness to trust him. I love what Brendan Manning says when he says, faithfulness requires the courage to risk everything on Jesus. Faithfulness requires the courage to risk everything on Jesus. So the question I have for you this morning is, where are you struggling to trust Jesus right now? What are the circumstances that perhaps you find yourself in that leave you feeling powerless? The invitation to you today is to take the risk. The invitation for you today is to hear the words of Jesus as words to you. Don't be afraid. Just believe. And what we can know with great assurance is that whatever it is that we're going through, he will go with us. Let's pray together. Our Father, we thank you this morning for this beautiful story. The story of this man and this woman who, socially and religiously speaking, were as different as night and day. And yet in this story, they both show for us the reality that the compassion of Jesus extends to all, regardless of social standing, regardless of gender, regardless of all the things that keep people apart in this world, that the compassion of Jesus goes out to all. And that we, when we find ourselves at the end of ourselves, can take the risk and to trust. And so, Lord, in this moment, I pray that for those here today who find themselves in those kinds of circumstances, that they would hear these words of Jesus as words to their hearts. Don't be afraid. Trust me. Father, would you help us to have a risky faith and to come to know and experience Christ's power and presence in our lives as we learn more and more what it means to lean on him, to trust him. And we pray all this in his name. Amen.